Hello, my name is Olga Ryrakovsky, and I am the Programs, Partners, and Engagement Manager here at the Vilna Shul, Boston Center for Jewish Culture. I also wanted to take this time to say that our thoughts and prayers are with Ukraine today, and thank you all for joining us this evening. The Vilna, located in historic Beacon Hill, is the last remaining immigrant-era synagogue building in Boston and now serves as the Center for Jewish Engagement. We offer opportunities to connect and explore one's culture, experience the arts, and engage in big ideas and pressing issues for Boston's Jewish community. We are thrilled to be hosting tonight's conversation with Ted Reinstein, who will be sharing a presentation on his book, Before Brooklyn, the Unsung Heroes Who Helped Break Baseball's Color Barrier. Before we get started, I wanted to clarify a few housekeeping rules. First, this program will be recorded and posted to the Vilna's YouTube channel shortly after tonight's program. Second, if you have a question, please enter it into the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom webinar screen, and there will be time to ask Ted questions at the end of the presentation. Lastly, all participants will be muted during this program, and the event should last about 70 minutes. And without further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce Ted Reinstein. Ted's bio is on our event page and will be pasted into the chat in just a moment. Thank you, Ted.
Thank you very much, Olga. Thank you very much. And thank you all for coming out and joining us tonight for this talk. I know we all wish that we were in person at the Vilna, historic landmark place that it is, but that'll come. That'll come. Tonight, as Olga said, I'm going to share with you my newest book, which is all about, in some ways, one of my lifelong heroes, Jackie Robinson. But more than that, it's about the people who paved the way for Jackie Robinson, but who have never really gotten the credit that they deserve. You know, I love when we're in person to begin my talk this way. And I've been doing this since September, and I asked this question to begin the talk. After Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in 1947, who became the second African-American Major League ball player? And when I ask that question, I get some very good responses, a lot of them very plausible. They sound really good, but I have yet to get the right answer when I ask that question. There's a good reason for that, because, well, for starters, it's a bit of a trick question, because the answer to that question, who was the second Black Major League ball player after Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier, was Jackie Robinson. But that speaks to the fact that the vast majority of people think that Jackie Robinson was the first Black Major League ball player, and that Jackie Robinson integrated Major League Baseball. Jackie Robinson was a courageous, inspirational pioneer, but he did not integrate Major League Baseball. Moses Fleetwood Walker integrated Major League Baseball. Some research today says there may have even been a ball player before Moses Fleetwood, but Moses Fleetwood Walker, for the most part, is seen as the first Black Major League ball player. But what it speaks to, and that's what we'll be looking at for the next 70 minutes, is the many, many ways that people really don't understand the history of what went into both the creating of the color barrier, baseball's really original sin, and what went into bringing it down. Moses Fleetwood Walker being a perfect case in point. Moses Fleetwood Walker should be somebody that people are familiar with. After all, he was as much a pioneer as Rosa Parks. He desegregated Major League Baseball a long time, 60 plus years before Jackie Robinson. And it speaks to something else that we don't really well understand, that when baseball was in its infancy, in the decade or two right after the Civil War, the 1870s, for instance, when Major League Baseball was created, baseball was an outlier, because unlike most of all the rest of American culture, society, politics, education, you name it, baseball in its infancy was actually integrated. It looked a little bit more like America. Bud Fowler, one of the most impassioned early Black ball players of all, someone whose story is thrilling when you read about how this man seemed to live, literally live to play baseball, playing baseball almost 365 days a year, literally circumnavigating not the hemisphere according to the seasons in order to play baseball pretty much year round. And his story goes from exciting and thrilling to heartbreaking. Frank Grant, the first Black professional ball player from Massachusetts, the Berkshires, and most famous of all, the Walker brothers. Moses Fleetwood sitting in that chair on the far left, and his younger brother, Weldie Walker, in the middle of the back row. They were teammates briefly in 1881 when they both played for the Oberlin, Ohio college baseball team, but Moses Fleetwood Walker would instantly stand out almost. He began playing very young, and his talent was recognizable right away. He was today what we would call a five-tool ball player, right? He was somebody who did every aspect of the game well. He was not only an incredibly smart young man, he was a gifted athlete. He was fast, he could run, he could throw, he could catch, he could hit with power. And he could catch so well that he transformed, literally single-handedly transformed the position of catcher. This is the era when not only is the phrase national pastime created, and by the way, that phrase is created to describe something that was unprecedented in American life, a sport that was now played nationally all over the country and which grew like mushrooms in its first decade, 2 decades. And the national pastime is seen as something that is like a national salve, a national balm, to help literally bind up the wounds of a nation that had literally just torn itself in two. And suddenly this sport, there's no Major League Basketball, football, hockey. There is only this new sport of baseball that is now being shared all over the country, growing fastest in some ways in the South, where Reconstruction is going on, right? So Moses Fleetwood Walker transforms the position of catcher. And this is also when the phrase backstop is coined. And at this time it's coined, today we speak of a backstop and we think of a structure, a physical structure on a ball field. No, it was coined to describe the catcher. And it was where in baseball's early days, you would stick the most least talented ball player on your team. And I'm sure you would say in one way or another to these early catchers, listen, you have one job. Just stop the damn ball from rolling off the field and stopping the game. It's all you got to do. But Moses Fleetwood Walker transforms it. He's an athlete. He's the first catcher to wear shin guards, first catcher to wear a chest protector, first catcher to wear a face mask, first catcher to throw a runner out attempting to steal a base. So he was good. How good? Well, he was signed by a Major League Baseball team. The Toledo Blue Stockings, at that time a Major League Baseball team in Toledo, Ohio, and Moses Fleetwood Walker in 1884 is signed to be their starting catcher. And he breaks the season with the Toledo Blue Stockings. And this is seen, mind you, this is reported on by mainstream newspapers as a really promising, encouraging event in America at this time. Because mind you, look at the date. This is 20 years, almost exactly 20 years from the end of the Civil War, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and the Emancipation Proclamation. And 20 years later, this national pastime that is sweeping the country like nothing ever has with sports, and a Black catcher has become the first Major League African-American. So it's seen as a very, very encouraging sign. Not to everybody. And unfortunately, one of those who found it not an encouraging sign, but a really vexing one, and worse, had a really, really big megaphone, Cap Anson. Adrian C. Constantin, Cap, he was better known as captain of the Chicago Cubs. Cap Anson was the first bona fide superstar of Major League Baseball. Think Mickey Mantle, DiMaggio. This was Cap Anson at the time. And by the way, the Cubs, like the Yankees, were the marquee team of early baseball. They were the marquee team, and Cap Anson was the first bona fide superstar that drew people from all over to come see the Cubs play. And there's no taking away what his talents were as a ball player. He was a slugger. This is the dead ball era, right? Balls are still wound by hand, not by machine. They don't go as far, yet he would hit 16, 18 home runs. Cap Anson, to this day, remarkably, still holds 2 or 3 batting records for the Chicago Cubs. So there's no taking that away from him as a ball player. As a person, that's a different story. Cap Anson was also an unrepentant racist. He was a vicious bully, and he had a really foul mouth to match. None of which is on his plaque in Cooperstown, but all true. And Cap Anson did not like the fact that he was taking the field against a black man, although he routinely used a different word. He played the game under protest, and he informed Major League Baseball that his Chicago Cubs would no longer take the field against any team that fielded a black ball player. So the Major League owners at that time have to take this threat seriously. This is, after all, the first recognizable superstar of the era. He's playing for the marquee team of the era, and they have to take that seriously, and they do. And they meet in the summer of 1887 in Buffalo, New York, and they enter into a gentleman's agreement that blacks will no longer be allowed to sign a major or minor league contract. And the gentleman's agreement part is important. It's significant, and it's telling. You know, you can have a gentleman's agreement that is, has the term because you're selling your old car to your kid or your cousin, and that's fine. And that's a handshake. That's fine. That's not what this was, and that's routinely not what gentlemen's agreements have been, where they have barred people, whether they're women, whether they're Jews, whether they're blacks. Gentlemen's agreements are agreements that tell you right off the bat, as in this one, where there's no recorded transcript, there's no recorded vote, nobody comes out to answer questions from the press afterward. It tells you that people are entering into some sort of an agreement that will not reflect well. It didn't then, it doesn't today, but it was done. The color barrier was now a reality. Blacks would no longer be allowed to play Major League Baseball. You know, I mentioned that Bud Fowler, really one of the most exciting early stars, black or white, of the early decades of professional baseball, that his story goes from thrilling to heartbreaking. I mentioned that this was a man who seemed to literally live to play baseball, and he did. And now he could no longer do the thing that he seemed to live for. I'm going to read a few times here from my book and jump back and forth from the talk, but you'll follow right along. He died of a blood disorder, Bud Fowler, in Frankfort, New York in 1913. He was only 55. His unmarked grave told not a word of a truly extraordinary life. For years since the color barrier began to spread in 1887, Fowler had relentlessly fought for a place in organized baseball. Along with the other early black professional players, he had continued to try and play in the shadow of the descending barrier as teams shed black ball players and refused to sign more. Fowler had uncommon talent, no question, but often it seemed his greatest skill was in seeming to somehow doggedly outrun the inescapable end, as if he simply willed himself to persevere, to compete and play, and even excel in an increasingly hostile landscape that, move about as he might, now seemed to expel him at shorter and shorter intervals. In Michigan in 1885, Bud Fowler was finally out of options. They all were, but he had outlasted all the others. Bud Fowler was literally the last black ball player standing. My skin is against me, Fowler wrote in 1895. If I had just been not quite so black, I might have been able to catch on as a Spaniard or something of that kind. The race prejudice is so strong, my black skin, it just bars me. Now, as the 20th century unfolded, it barred them all. The color barrier was complete. It would take another 50 years of fierce Fowler-like will and determination to break through again. So the color barrier is now a reality, and we're into from the 1880s to the 1890s. And this is a period when we said that baseball at the outset was an outlier, that baseball, unlike much of the rest of America, is actually integrated in its own small way. And now it no longer is. Now baseball is just like the rest of America, which is to say, not only segregated, but segregated by state sanction. This is the period of Plessy versus Ferguson, which first makes legal segregation on transportation in a couple of southern states, Alabama and Louisiana, but it quickly spreads because the Supreme Court sanctions it. Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson, that's the famous separate but equal doctrine, right? Which was always was half right. It was always separate. It was never equal. And it grows to all facets of American life, including baseball. Doesn't matter now whether you're talking about playing baseball or, as in this picture, which side of the room you're going to get a drink of water from. Now, Jim Crow is officially part of America. But the point to remember as you go through the teens now, reach up to about 1920, Black baseball endures. Blacks were kept from playing Major League Baseball, but in their own way, on their own diamonds, most of the time in the shadows. They never stopped playing a high level of baseball. They never stopped playing professional baseball during this entire period. There are some extraordinary Black barnstorming teams. There are even some attempts at creating official leagues, but most of them die out and fall apart. But they never stopped playing a high level of professional baseball. The frustration is that they can't play at the most elite showcase level in America, the major leagues. And few people who had played Black professional baseball were as frustrated and angry and anguished about being kept out as Rube Foster. Rube Foster had been himself an incredible professional Black ball player. Played most of his career for the Chicago Giants. He was 6'3", 245 pounds, a fearsome presence on the mound. Unquestionably, one of the first very few extraordinary Black pitchers. This is a man who has to endure being told, you talk about a backhanded compliment, being told by the likes of Christy Mathewson, one of the greatest pitchers to have ever lived. When they played against each other in a barnstorming game, Mathewson told Foster, you know, it's too bad you're Black because you could star on any major league team. Well, that's exactly what animated Rube Foster, even knowing that he would never make the major leagues, to create an elite level of league play for Blacks. And Rube Foster is the father of the Negro Leagues, the father of Black baseball. And the Negro Leagues, which he will create in 1920, are the single most significant, most vital unsung hero in the entire saga of breaking the color barrier. Just about this time of year almost, in 1920, in Kansas City, Missouri, the Negro Leagues are born. Now, Rube Foster is sitting right there in the front row, in the center. I want to draw your attention to a gentleman who is two down to his left, sitting in the front row. He's the only white owner in the entire history of the Negro Leagues. And I don't point out Jayle Wilkinson as some sort of racial peculiarity. I point him out because he's an extraordinary man in his own right. But more importantly for this story, there is a direct line, 25-year glide path, right down the line. From this moment, when Jayle Wilkinson is the owner of the Kansas City Monarchs, one of the legendary Negro League teams, takes over and is one of the first founders of the Negro Leagues, to Jackie Robinson. Because 25 years down the road, Jayle Wilkinson will sign Jackie Robinson to his first professional baseball contract. And only 6 months later, Robinson will break the color barrier. So the Negro Leagues are born, the Negro Leagues take off. They take off to the extent that their growth seems to replicate the explosive growth of Major League Baseball itself. And now Blacks are seeing people like John Pops Lloyd, Judy Johnson, Oscar Charleston, one of the greatest fielders to have ever lived, and Cool Papa Bell, arguably the fastest human being to have ever played baseball. And I say that Blacks were seeing these ball players play. They were initially. For the first 8 to 10 years of the Negro Leagues, Blacks were coming out to watch, not whites. What makes the Negro Leagues the most important unsung hero in this story is the effect they had not on Blacks, but on whites. Don't forget, Blacks knew about people like Judy Johnson. Blacks were watching people like Pops Lloyd from the very start. They were watching and admiring Cool Papa Bell from the very start. It was whites who had to see these people play and did finally come to see these people play. And it was their minds that had to change because they were in charge of Major League Baseball. So the entire decade of the 1920s, the Negro Leagues take off. How much did they take off? They start out with 14 teams, then there are 26 teams. They separate into a Negro National League, a Negro American League, the first two Negro World Series, and it seems like their growth is unstoppable until, alas, all growth for everyone stops in America. Because, of course, at the end of the 1920s, you have the Great Depression. And you know, I often think that we today don't really fully grasp anymore just how cataclysmic the Great Depression really was. Now, maybe some of you had a parent or a relative who grew up during the Depression, and you heard those stories. My late father grew up, was 10, 11 years old in the worst years of the Depression, 1930, 31, 32, 33. This is a period when a quarter of all Americans are unemployed. And in minority communities, flip that, 3/4 unemployed. Now, there's a good reason for that, because this growth of the Negro Leagues is the same period of the Great Migration, right? The greatest movement of African Americans from the South to cities of the Midwest, and especially the Northeast, where they're in search of better jobs, better paying jobs, better quality of life for themselves and their children. The good news is they found it. They found it in cities from Denver through Chicago to Pittsburgh and on north, Philadelphia, New York, Boston. They found it. That was good. What wasn't good is that because of the timing, they were very often the last who had been hired when the Depression hit, which often meant first fired. So in minority communities like Atlanta, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, minority unemployment is 70%. This is a period when 30,000 businesses a year are going under, including the Negro Leagues. Gone. Up in smoke, all that growth, gone. Now, you might wonder how many major league teams went out of business during the Great Depression. After all 16 of every American league, of a major league team at that time, was in and of itself, a thriving business, subject to all the same cataclysm that other businesses were experiencing. So not so many major league teams went out of business. Good reason for that too, because at that time, the 16 major league teams at that time, every single one of them, unlike today, today, it can cost upwards of $700-800 million or more dollars to own a major league team across all the major league sports, right? So today it's not uncommon to have a consortium of investors and business people who collectively are buying a major league team. Not the case in the 1930s. All 16 major league teams, every single one of them were owned by a white, wealthy owner. Now, listen, I'm not begrudging them, listen, they worked hard for their businesses to prosper and be able to buy a team. And they did. Actually, Tom Yawkey did not work so hard. His stepfather worked very hard for the money that he gave to Tom Yawkey when Tom Yawkey was 16 years old. And then about 5 years later, Tom Yawkey came into another $16.3 million, and he bought the Boston Red Sox. But these owners were insulated from the worst effects of the Depression by their wealth. And I mentioned the Cubs before. Tom Yawkey was a relative pauper compared to some of the other major league owners of the period. I mentioned the Cubs. The Cubs were owned by a guy named Phil Wrigley. Chances are you have, over the course of your life, bought a little bit of Phil Wrigley's product, chewing gum. The St. Louis Cardinals were owned by Gussie Busch. Gussie Busch was brewing a little beer out there in St. Louis, so they were insulated. The Negro Leagues, not insulated. All of their revenue was derived from ticket sales for the most part. If you are trying to cobble together a few bucks to put some food on the table for your kids or pay the mortgage or the rent, you are not shelling out money for baseball tickets. Some of the Negro League teams would sometimes get some slender lines of credit from Black-owned banks. Black-owned banks also biting the dust during the Great Depression. But one single Negro League team manages to survive and keep going in the worst years of the Depression. And our friend Jayle Wilkinson, the owner of the Kansas City Monarchs, pops up again. Because Jayle Wilkinson refused to lay off his players. And he was upfront with them. He said, the only way, guys, we're going to be able to keep doing this is to pretty much play baseball every day. And they did. They did. They barnstormed continuously all around the country, Really, this picture of them is barnstorming on their way through Canada in one of the worst years of the Depression. And, last fall, I believe October or November, I thought of Jayle Wilkinson when another extraordinary business owner died. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the legendary Aaron Feuerstein. Aaron Feuerstein was the owner of Malden Mills in Lawrence, Massachusetts. And in 1992, when the Lawrence Mills burned down, Aaron Feuerstein refused to lay off his workers. Even though there was no job to go to, he kept them on the payroll. until the mills were rebuilt. And when Aaron Forrestine died, I thought of Jayle Wilkinson, because that's essentially what Jayle Wilkinson did. Now, that was great, but he couldn't have kept doing that forever. He simply couldn't have. But fortunately for him, and extraordinarily in terms of history, the Negro Leagues are brought back to life. And what makes this doubly extraordinary is that nothing was being brought to life in the depths of the Depression in the early 1930s. Things were being snuffed out. Things were dying. Things were going under. They weren't coming back to life. And yet, incredibly, in Pittsburgh, which creates this incredible bridge to Pittsburgh, to Brooklyn, the Negro Leagues are brought back to life. And they're brought back to life because of these two guys. And these two guys represent, well, let's just put it this way, the only thing that they ever really communicated with directly, and the only thing that they ever cooperated on, was bringing the Negro Leagues back to life. Other than that, you are looking at two men who loathed each other. Arch nemesis, lifelong enemies. They hated each other's guts, these two. And the only thing they cooperated on was perhaps the most important thing either one of them ever did in their lives. Cumberland Posey Jr., son of another Black pioneer in Pittsburgh. He was really one of the very first successful, celebrated Black civil engineers. Tremendous businessman, started 2 or 3 of his own thriving businesses. I'm sure he had hoped that his son, Cum Posey Jr., would have followed him into the family business. But Cumberland Posey Jr. was a sports fanatic. Basketball, which is a relatively new sport then, and baseball. Baseball won out. He played, he coached. And in the late 20s, Cumberland Posey Jr. is approached by a group in Pittsburgh to save a legendary Black ball club, the Homestead Grays. Now, the Homestead Grays are more legendary today than they were then. They were a great team. They had a long history in Pittsburgh, but they weren't the famous team they are today. But Cumberland Posey agreed to take over the team and buy the team. And he did. And he turned out to be an incredibly talented baseball strategist, tactician. Even more importantly, he was a great promoter. More importantly, he turned out to be a tremendous motivator of young Black men. And those who came to play for him were inspired, truly inspired to play their best, play in ways at a level they never had before. But the proof is in the pudding. How much success did the Homestead Grays, one of the most legendary Negro League teams in history, have? Consider. In 1931, the Homestead Grays had what many baseball historians consider the greatest single baseball season of any baseball team, any color, anywhere, ever. They won 143 games. Let me put that in context for you. At this time, Major League Baseball plays only 154 games, not the 162 they play today. The Homestead Grays won 143. Now, not to be outdone, Cumberland Posey's arch nemesis, Gus Greenlee, promptly tried to outdo him. Now, Gus Greenlee, very different background, grows up in Pittsburgh. He goes off to fight in World War I. He is wounded at the Battle of Verdun. He's decorated. He comes back to Pittsburgh in the depths of both Prohibition and the Depression. Needs a job, cobbles some money together. He buys a rickety old car so he can have a one-man taxi cab company. And he is approached about running liquor for actually the Latrobe Brewing Company, which existed then, still exists today, right? Rolling Rock beer, right. So Prohibition, they approach him. Would he take a job running their bootleg hooch all around to the speakeasies in Pittsburgh? And he does. Now, needless to say, that was illegal, but he did it. And he never worked another legal job the rest of his life. Gus Greenlee, very complicated figure. He was a crook because the rest of his life was all about loan sharking and running numbers, gambling, but he was very much a Robin Hood figure in the Hill District, the Black section of Pittsburgh. It was just well known that if you ran into trouble, if your kid was sick, if you had a medical bill you couldn't pay, if you couldn't float the rent, the mortgage, all you had to do was get out word to Gus Greenlee's people, and the white envelope would magically slip under your door. You'd open that door on Christmas Day, and there would be a big Easter basket, big basket full of food for Christmas dinner. So Gus Greenlee, very much kind of a Robin Hood figure. He opened up a jazz club, which became legendary, the Crawford Grill. on Crawford Street in the Hill District of Pittsburgh. It was known as a melting pot. It was a place that all people were welcome. And you name the jazz great of the era. Count Basie, Ellington, Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald, Louis Armstrong, they all played the Crawford Grill. And just like Posey, Gus Greenlee is approached to save a black ball club in Pittsburgh, and he agrees to save the team. Now, it's not really clear how much Gus Greenlee feels about baseball, but he does realize that both his jazz club, the Crawford Grill, and owning a baseball team will provide a really nice way for him to launder some of his ill-gotten money. So he takes over the team. He renames them the Crawfords so that he can better promote his jazz club. And a year after his arch nemesis, Posey wins 143 games, Gus Greenlee wins almost 100 games. Now, talented team, but he did it mostly by doing something that he was good at, kind of boosting something. In this case, he boosted some of his rivals' best players. Two, most significantly. If you look in the back row, the tallest guy there is a very talented young pitcher at that time named Satchel Paige. Next to him is a very talented young catcher and slugger named Josh Gibson. I know you know the names. Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson are, without any question, the two most celebrated black ball players of all time. They are two of the greatest baseball players, black, white, or polka dot, of all time. And while most of the heroes in this story are unsung, they are very much sung. Satchel Paige, one of the most famous ball players and Americans who ever lived. Josh Gibson, less well known because he was much more retiring. He was much more soft-spoken. Satchel Paige did make it to the major leagues. Josh Gibson did not. Josh Gibson was an incredible hitter, hit arguably the longest home run ever hit in Yankee Stadium. And the reason why these two players are so important to this story is that these two players changed the narrative. Whites would look at some of the early black ball players like Judy Johnston, Oscar Charleston, Cool Papa Bell, and they would say undeniably, these black ball players could play on any white major league team. When Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson come along, it shifts to not only could they play on any major league team, but if a white fan saw Satchel Paige play as he did in a barnstorming game against the New York Yankees in the 1930s at Yankee Stadium and watched Satchel Paige strike out Joe DiMaggio 3 times, only time DiMaggio ever struck out 3 times in the game against Satchel Paige, then you found yourself saying, well, not only could this guy play in the major leagues, I want him on the Yankees. So why can't, oh, right, he can't play on the Yankees because of his skin color. So they changed the narrative single-handedly. How good, by the way, was Josh Gibson? He was known, even when he was playing, universally called the Black Babe Ruth. Funny story, he actually met the real-life Babe Ruth late in his playing days. He met the real-life Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth threw his big, meaty arm around him, as he liked to do, and he shook him a little bit, as he liked to do, and he said, Mr. Gibson, what an honor to meet you. Hey, I understand they call you the Black Babe Ruth. How about that? And Josh Gibson said very quietly, as he liked to do, and he said, Mr. Ruth, with all due respect, you know, my people call you the White Josh Gibson. How about that? Now, question, how do we know so much about the Negro Leagues? I've just been going on for 10 minutes about the Negro Leagues. There are entire libraries full of books about the Negro Leagues. I've read dozens of them. How do we know so much? Not one single white mainstream newspaper in the entire history of the Negro Leagues ever assigned a beat reporter to be dedicated to the Negro Leagues. Not even the Negro Leagues as a whole, never mind one team. Never happened. So how do we know so much about the Negro Leagues and players like Josh Gibson and all the others if the white press never covered them? The black press. The black press, second only to the Negro Leagues themselves, the most significant unsung hero in the entire saga of breaking the color barrier, because it was the black press that would raise the profile, not just of the Negro Leagues, not just the players like Josh Gibson and Cool Papa Bell and Satchel Paige, but would raise the issue again and again and again of the fact that the color barrier existed. People sometimes forgot that. You watched your Cardinals play and your Pirates play, and you forgot often that blacks couldn't play on that team. The black press made sure that people were not allowed to forget. People like pioneering publishers like Robert Lee Vann of the Pittsburgh Courier, the greatest distribution of any black newspaper in American history, just slightly more than Robert Sengstack Abbott's legendary Chicago Defender. These publishers hired writers like Wendell Smith and Sam Lacey. And these two writers, it's interesting, as a journalist, you're always thinking in terms of being impartial, being objective, just laying out the facts and leaving editorial opinion aside. These two players did something that was really unprecedented for journalists who were respected, and they were gifted writers. Yes, they would report on the game. Yes, they would write a feature story about a Josh Gibson or a Satchel Paige, but they would also, by the way, undercharge from their publishers, they would also always make sure that they made a comment about the fact that these players, gifted as they are, could be playing on your major league team were it not for the fact that your major league team is not allowed to sign a black ball player. So how did this consciousness get raised? Mind you, you could find the Pittsburgh Courier at the Chicago Defender in the 1930s all over the country. You could find the Pittsburgh Courier in Spokane, Washington, Fort Worth, Texas, Miami, Florida, Bangor, Maine. How? It was all they could do. These newspapers worked on a shoestring budget. It was all they could do to make deadline. It was all they could do to get the paper out on the street. It was all they could do to get the paper out on the street into the 6 or 7, newsstands that carried them in the Hill District. Just the black section of their cities is all they were concerned with. That was all they could do. So how are they getting their paper all around America? Here's how. The single most improbable ally in the entire story, the Pullman Porters. The Pullman Porters, it's interesting the things that were having a golden age at this time, right? So the 20s, 30s, 40s of golden age of the Negro Leagues and black baseball. The 20s, 30s, and 40s of golden age of the black press. And the 20s, 30s, and 40s of the golden age of overnight train travel. And the Pullman Porters are the face of overnight train travel. So you might be wondering, what could they possibly have to do? Pretty busy on the train, often sleeping, if they're lucky, 3 or 4 hours a night, if they're lucky. So what could they possibly have to do with breaking the color barrier in Major League Baseball? Because those pioneering black publishers were also ingenious promoters, always looking for a way to increase their distribution. And they saw in the Pullman Porters the same thing that blacks all over the country and whites saw about the Pullman Porters, in that they did something no other blacks in America, most Americans were not doing that. They were traveling all over the country all the time. And those newspaper publishers thought, if they could only somehow be made to be an ally in our struggle, think of what they could do to distribute our newspapers. And they agreed. Not all the Pullman Porters. They didn't need all the Pullman Porters. They only need a few Pullman Porters per run per train. And they got that. Now, mind you, the Pullman Porters who were helping to do this would have been fired on the spot, but they did it. They helped distribute black newspapers surreptitiously all over America. And that raised the consciousness for communities, not just black communities, black and white communities all over America, about the color barrier, so that people weren't able to forget. And now we're up to 1940. So we're only 5 years and about 10 minutes away from the end of our talk. So how does the color barrier fall in just 5 years? Major League Baseball was no closer to dropping the color barrier in 1940 than it had been in 1930 or 1920 or 1910 for that matter. So what happens? This decade, the 30s, end with another cataclysm, just like the 20s ended with the Great Depression. You, of course, recall that the 30s end with World War II. And in New York, which at that time was not yet a hotbed for breaking the color barrier, along comes another unlikely figure, like the Pullman Porters, improbable, unlikely. Lester Rodney was nobody's profile of an ally in the struggle to break the color barrier. He was in New York. He was white. He was Jewish. He was a communist. Hey, nobody's perfect. But he was also a gifted sports writer. Not only that, he particularly hated the color barrier. And Lester Rodney, who, by the way, would have worked for anybody, he would have written for anybody, but he happened to catch on his first writing job with the Daily Worker, which was the newspaper outlet for the American Communist Party, which in the late 1930s added a sports section. That was smart of them. And they needed a sports editor. Enter Lester Rodney. So Lester Rodney is the first person to frame the argument for breaking the color barrier in a way that it had never been framed before, which was in the context of World War II. Lester Rodney begins to remind his readers with every column he writes that America is going to war. Blacks as well as whites are now being trained to fight, to defend America. Blacks as well as whites will be shipping overseas to fight for America. And blacks as well as whites will be asked to fight and, if necessary, die to defend America. Blacks as well as whites will come home, in some cases, in boxes. And those who come back, who survive, who are black, will have just been asked to die, if necessary, to defend America. And they will return to America where they're still second-class citizens, where they still can't sit where they want on a bus and they still can't play Major League Baseball. And that argument begins to resonate in a way the argument for breaking the color barrier never had before. It resonates in a way that it is the argument that will carry the day. It is the argument that will take this struggle right to the end in 5 years. And then America, of course, is at war. And it was anguishing for blacks to go off and fight. Here you are going off to fight and knowing that you may die, and you are still a second-class citizen for the country that is asking you to die, if necessary. And the Pittsburgh Courier, using Lester Rodney's framing of the argument now, launches the Double V campaign. Double V, double victory, which was first, go off, defeat Adolf Hitler. Come home, defeat Jim Crow. That handkerchief was worn, given out for free by the Pittsburgh Courier. It was worn in the jacket sleeve of all members of the Tuskegee Airmen, the most celebrated all-black unit in World War II. But it is another all-black unit in World War II, which you almost surely have never heard of. I had never heard of the 761st Tank Battalion. The 761st was the first all-black armored unit. It fought for Patton's Third Army. It set records for consecutive days spent at the front. It was one of the first units to cross into Germany, one of the first units to liberate a death camp. And most significantly for our story, it had a young lieutenant, one of their officers. And you see him in the inset picture there under the turret, under the barrel. A young lieutenant named Jack Roosevelt Robinson. Jackie Robinson was absolutely excited. He was inspired. He could not wait to help take control of the 761st and lead them into combat in Europe. Didn't get there. Just before the 761st shipped out for Europe, Jackie Robinson at Fort Hood in Texas flunked his final physical. An old football injury had reared its head. He had been an All-American at UCLA, and Jackie Robinson was not cleared for combat. He asked for special permission to go with the 761st as a morale officer. It was denied. Jackie Robinson said it was the most crushing disappointment of his life at that time. And the 761st leaves. Jackie Robinson stays at Fort Hood in Texas. He leaves the hospital. He decides he's going to go back to the base and have a drink at the Black Officers Club. He gets on a bus circling Fort Hood. Fort Hood is an enormous base, one of the biggest in the world. So he gets on a bus circling the base, and he takes a seat right behind the driver, front row. Not wanting any trouble, doesn't expect any trouble, knows that in fact, there doesn't have to be any trouble. Jackie Robinson knows something that the bus driver probably does not know. If he did know, he may not have cared. Jackie Robinson knows that 48 hours earlier, President Roosevelt has signed an executive order forbidding segregation on transportation within domestic American military bases. Jackie Robinson knows he has a right now to sit wherever he wants on the bus. Bus driver may not know, may not care. Bus begins to fill up with white passengers. Bus driver tells Jackie Robinson he's going to move to the back of the bus. Jackie Robinson tells the driver, not happening. I'm not moving. Bus driver stops at an MP station, Sentry Station. 2 MPs get on the bus. They handcuff Jackie Robinson. He's taken off the bus, arrested, court-martialed, insubordination. Now, I wonder how many of you know that Jackie Robinson was court-martialed. In all likelihood, you don't know. If Jackie Robinson had stayed court-martialed, none of us would know who Jackie Robinson is, because Jackie Robinson would never have been able to be signed by Branch Rickey if he'd been dishonorably discharged by the US Army. But he beat the court-martial. Now, he's done with the military. honorably discharged and he needs a new job. And he writes a letter to our old friend, Jayle Wilkinson, the owner of the Kansas City Monarchs. And he says, Mr. Wilkinson, I understand some of your best players are not yet returned from Europe. And I wonder if I can try out for the Monarchs. And Jayle Wilkinson writes back to Jackie Robinson and he says, Mr. Robinson, I know who you are, and you don't have to try out for me. You got a job. And he goes to Houston, spring training for the Monarchs. In 1945, he breaks camp with the Monarchs, and Jackie Robinson is officially a member of the Kansas City Monarchs in April 1945, which is when the final battle to break the color barrier is about to be fought. And it's going to be fought in Boston. Because in Boston, at the same time Jackie Robinson is breaking camp with the Monarchs, Izzy Mutchnick in Boston is continuously searching for some way to break the color barrier. Loves baseball like Lester Rodney, and using Lester Rodney's inspiring message about how we have to break the color barrier in the light of the Second World War, Izzy Mutchnick has been inspired to find some way, any way he can, to figure out some way to have leverage, to somehow force maybe the city's two Major League Baseball teams to at least give a tryout to black ball players. Izzy Mutchnick, an inspiring, extraordinary story in his own right. Boston boy, Jewish, grows up in Boston, goes off to Harvard, graduates Harvard Law School, brilliant young lawyer, could have worked for any number of what they used to call the white shoe Boston law firms. Could have, but refused to change his name. So he set up his own law practice. He was somebody who lived by something that I know a lot of you folks are familiar with. He seemed to live by what in Judaism is called tikkun olam, which translates from the Hebrew pretty much verbatim as repair the world. And it was something Izzy Mutchnick saw at the heart of breaking the color barrier, that for him, that represented an opportunity to do tikkun olam. And as a lawyer, he found it. He found it in an old archaic blue law, which many of which still existed at that time. And at that time in Boston, there was a blue law which forbade Major League Baseball from being played in Boston on a Sunday without the unanimous consent of the Boston City Council. So I buried the lead here because Izzy Mutchnick was a member of the Boston City Council, the second Jewish member of the Boston City Council. He would go on to become the first Jewish chairman of the Boston School Committee. But in seeing this blue law, he realized he had leverage. He had leverage. All he had to do was withhold his vote, and he could force the Red Sox to do something. And he promptly fired off a letter to the brain trust of the Boston Red Sox, which you see here, Yawkey, Joe Cronin, the manager at the time. The tall guy standing in the back is the general manager at that time of the Boston Red Sox, Eddie Collins. Eddie Collins was himself a Hall of Fame second baseman, general manager of the Red Sox, and he got this letter asking him from this city councilor, Isidore Mutchnick, to consider, please, holding a tryout for qualified black ball players. Eddie Collins is a bit of a slow-talking, sweet-talking Southerner, and he wrote a letter back to Izzy Mutchnick in his style, and he said, "My esteemed counselor Mutchnick." Basically, he said, in my entire tenure with the Boston Red Sox, it might interest you to know that not a single black ball player has ever inquired about employment from the Boston Red Sox. I can only conclude this signifies a lack of interest. So, basically what do you want me to do? And look, Izzy Mutchnick was a brilliant young man, and he knew when he was being fed a load of BS. And he waited and waited and waited till just before that year's vote, which was coming up to allow the Red Sox to play Sunday baseball. And he sent a cable back to Eddie Collins, and he said, "Mr. Collins, it appears you are not serious about entertaining my request. So this letter should serve to inform you I will be withholding my vote to allow the Red Sox to play baseball on Sunday in 1945. Well, I don't know what the time duration was between Eddie Collins opening up that cable and appearing in Tom Yawkey's office. I'm pretty sure it was under 5 minutes, because that would have been an economic cataclysm for the Red Sox in 1945. This is pre-TV. It's all about ticket revenue. Not only that, Major League Baseball at that time, every single Sunday, every single Major League team plays two games, a doubleheader every Sunday. For the Red Sox to have not been able to play half their doubleheaders would have been an economic catastrophe. So they realized they were going to have to accede to the city councilor's demand and have a tryout. And they wrote back to Izzy Mutchnick, and they said, you can have your tryout, three black ball players. That's it. There is to be no press whatsoever, or the deal is off. Izzy Mutchnick grudgingly agreed. He knew a lot about Boston's bylaws and blue laws, but he did not know much about black ball players. So he consulted with Wendell Smith of the Pittsburgh Courier. He asked him for some help in picking out 3 qualified black ball players to have a tryout for the Boston Red Sox. And Wendell Smith picked out 3 players for Izzy Mutchnick: Marvin Williams, Sam Jethro, and a promising young infielder for the Kansas City Monarchs, Jackie Robinson. And they trooped to Boston, all prepared to meet at Gate D at Fenway Park on the morning of April 12th, 1945. And they would have, had history not intervened. April 12th, 1945 is the day that Franklin Roosevelt died, and America shut down. Tryout canceled. Now, 24 hours later, America starts opening back up. 48 hours later, America is pretty much back to normal. But not the Red Sox, who curiously seem to be still grief-stricken and deep, deep in mourning. They did everything apparently but hang black bunting from the outside of Fenway Park. What they were trying to do was run out the clock and avoid the tryout. And they almost made it. All they had to do was run out 2 more days, because on the afternoon of April 16th, 1945, the Red Sox will catch a train at 1 o'clock in the afternoon from Back Bay Station to New York, where they will open up the 1945 season against the Yankees the next day on the 17th. And they almost did it. But on the morning of April 16th, 1945, a white Boston sports writer, Dave Egan, breaks the story. And he breaks it in the form of a front page letter to people who are picking up the paper on their way to work at 5, 6, 7 o'clock. And basically, it's a letter to the city of Boston. You may not know this, dear reader, it says, but at this hour, there are 3 Negro ball players, as he wrote, who for a week now have been marooned in a hotel room. They have been promised a tryout by your Boston Red Sox, who are now reneging on their promise and are trying to skip town. Well, the Red Sox realized they were going to have this tryout. So they called up Izzy Mutchnick. They said, get over here. He did. With Wendell Smith, they trooped over to Fenway Park. The 3 ball players suited up. They took the field. They ran the bases, took some infield, took some batting practice. Just about 45 minutes later, they were called off the field. They were thanked very much, and they were told the Red Sox will be in touch. None of the players ever heard from the Red Sox again the rest of their lives. But you know who was paying rapt attention that morning? A little bit to the south in Brooklyn, at the offices of the Brooklyn Dodgers on Montague Street in Brooklyn Heights. Branch Rickey, part owner, general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers, who was terrified that morning that Tom Yawkey might go ahead and upset his plans, which have been percolating for almost a year now to sign Jackie Robinson to break the color barrier. But of course, we know in hindsight, Branch Rickey had nothing to worry about, because it was going to take Tom Yawkey another 14 years to break the color barrier. But it was only going to take Branch Rickey 6 more months before he would sign Jackie Robinson, as you see in this photograph here, to a minor league contract with Montreal Royals, the top farm club of the Brooklyn Dodgers. And 2 years later, in April 1945, almost a day, 2 years later, to the day that he had tried out for the Red Sox, Jackie Robinson took the field in Brooklyn, wearing number 42, as he strode out to his position at first base amid the din of cheering fans, of broadcasters announcing history, and of exploding flashbulbs capturing it. There were also 2 inaudible sounds at Ebbets Field that day, of a wall falling and of a cheering that could not be heard with the ear, only with the heart. It rose from those not present physically, but spiritually, those who could not be seen, but were there just the same. Moses Fleetwood Walker didn't live to see it. And by the time he died, broken, bitter, alcoholic, he couldn't even imagine it. But he was there. Bud Fowler tried his entire life to outrun the wall that rose up to deny him at the end at every turn. In life, it seemed that he had been everywhere, anywhere, a black man desperately trying to just play baseball as long as he possibly could. Now he was in Brooklyn. Even as they worked their regular shifts that day on their way west or south or north, the Pullman Porters, some of them rolling along the rails less than a mile from Ebbets Field that day, they were there. The Negro Leaguers, past and present, those who had come too early and those who were young enough to imagine that they too might now walk through that wall, they were there. And the African-American veterans of the war just ended and those who had given their lives, they were there. On this momentous day, a ball game was played before a crowd both present and cheering, and another crowd silent and unseen. They watched the game, and they watched the terrible wrong being finally righted. To be sure, even as a black ball player bounded onto an otherwise all-white field, racism was still alive and well in Brooklyn and clear on across America. So many other barriers remained in place. Alas, many still are. But on this day, some of the hurt and the humiliation were salved. On this day, hope and faith that had long seemed to have run out were finally redeemed. On this day, the long arc of the moral universe seemed to bend improbably toward Brooklyn, touching down on the grass and the dirt of a creaky old ballpark where the familiar white lines would no longer bar a black ball player. And at the bottom of the seventh inning, when Jackie Robinson, as you see, laid down a perfect bunt and raced toward first base, he was not alone. That invisible crowd was suddenly right there, running right alongside, willing him on. And as Robinson sprinted safely onto second base and caught his breath, they exhaled with him. After all, it had been a long, uncertain journey, and they had helped him get there. The next Dodger batter doubled. Jackie Robinson rounded third, and he was home. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, folks. And I'll be happy to take any questions. I'll invite Olga back out to help moderate the Q&A, and I'm happy to take any questions that anybody might have. Thank you. I'll tell you what, I'm going to leave this up so that if anybody is interested in purchasing the book or any of my others, all you got to do is go to my website. If you'd like a signed copy of the book or any book, just shoot me an email. And I will shoot you an email right back. I'll let you know how you can get yourself a signed copy. I'll ship it out to you for free. It'll be signed and there'll be no tax, none of which you're able to do on Amazon. I will just say. With that, happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ted, for such an incredible and fascinating presentation and conversation.
Oh, you're welcome.
I certainly learned quite a lot. And so just want to thank you again for coming
Absolutely.
to join us.
Thank you.
And I would love to start just by asking you, what inspired you to start researching about this and take on this big project and really get so involved in digging deep into this issue?
Well, as I said at the start, Olga, Jackie Robinson has been literally a lifelong hero of mine. I have on my bookshelf over here not a sign. I wish it was signed. A picture of Jackie Robinson that I've had since I've been about 13 or 14 years old. So he was always a hero of mine. And by the time I was in my mid-20s or what have you, I really had digested so much about his life. What I did not know until later was all these people who had come before him, all these people who had helped pave the way for him. And, as I began to really digest some of these fascinating stories, especially people like the Pullman Porters, who I didn't even know about until just the last few years, I just realized that these people had really never got much of the credit that they deserved. So I would say, simply put, that's really what was behind it. I mean, it was really sort of a feeling that it's an opportunity for me not only to delve into stories that I found fascinating and inspiring, and I thought would be of interest to others, but also at the same time, be getting some credit to some people who, in many cases, have never had it.
Definitely. I have a question here from Daniel, and he wants to know, what baseball team are you a fan of, if any, and what do you think of the current state of the game?
Let's work backward. Not much. And am I a fan of a team? Look, Daniel, I've always subscribed. I've always subscribed to the notion that you want to, if you can, be true to your school. I grew up in Boston. First team I ever rooted for was the Red Sox. And like I'm sure maybe you and many, many other people, as we got older and as we understood some of the sad history of the Red Sox, then, you begin to regard them in a fuller picture, which is to say that, much like people sometimes, and that they are deeply flawed, deeply flawed. Baseball is flawed in that it barred black ball players. The Red Sox are doubly flawed because they barred them longer than any other team. So, that's a special, it's a special, almost, tortured kind of relationship, I think, that older Red Sox fans, as you come of age and really understand this history, have. So, the Red Sox were always my team, but the Brooklyn Dodgers, in many ways, are my favorite all-time team. The 1955 Dodgers, they won the World Series. Sandy Koufax is my all-time favorite ball player. So, in many, I would say that. As far as the game today, listen, here they are at strike. Baseball will not start the season on time. I'm not sure how much I care. I care about baseball. I still love the game of baseball. The business of baseball is a different matter. It's very difficult to feel any real empathy. That's not even the word. Here you have a labor dispute, and both participants in the labor dispute are making, for players, millions, in some cases, tens and hundreds of $1,000,000 a year. And you just multiply that a few times for the owners. That's not a labor dispute most of us can really get behind. So, anyone else?
Yes, we have some more questions from Ruther. Why was the tryout with the Red Sox and not the Braves? Wasn't Tom Yawkey a well-known racist?
So, two different parts of that question there. Let me answer the two teams first. So, it is true that the Braves also did not agree to the tryout. To the Braves' credit, in 1938, which I go into at length in the book, and it's actually how I start the book. In 1938, the Braves, unlike the Red Sox, who refused, the part owner and general manager of the Boston Braves agreed to a meeting with a black sports writer in Boston, Mabry Counts, better known as Doc Counts, one of the great unsung heroes in the book, who became the first black sports writer to get an official press pass from the Boston Red Sox. The Braves agreed to meet with Doc Counts, a black man, in 1938, to talk about issues related to breaking the color barrier and having the Braves allow their park to be used by black professional teams. That's to the Braves' credit. Also to the Braves' credit is only 3 years after the color barrier fell, they also broke the color barrier. And the first black baseball player in Boston, Major League Baseball player in Boston, was Sam Jethro with the Boston Braves. So light years difference than the Red Sox. You asked, was Tom Yawkey was not thought of as a racist when Tom Yawkey was owning the team. There were people who wondered about that. There were people who felt that way. He's not known the way he is today. When I think a fuller and fuller picture, has emerged. But today there's no escaping it. And sometimes people ask me, do you think Tom Yawkey's a racist? And I hate to use a time-worn cliche, but the only thing you can ask yourself in response is, if it looks like a duck and sounds like a duck and quacks like a duck, is it a damn duck? Yeah. Yes, he was a racist. I will say in the book, I describe him as a benign racist. I describe him as those racists from the South, more genteel, educated, successful, who I say in the book like their racism the way they like their bourbon, right? Kind of mellow and not quite as strident as some of the more outright racists like Cap Anson. That wasn't Tom Yawkey's style, but racism is racism.
Then we have from Paula, what is your next project?
Paula, I wish I could tell you, but I don't have a firm, I have a lot of ideas floating around right now. it's likely not going to be about baseball. It may be a foray into fiction. I don't know, but I'm glad you asked, because every time I'm asked, the fire I turn up under myself to get that next project started gets turned up a little higher. So I actually appreciate it, but I can't give you an exact answer. But thank you for asking.
I guess I have a question about when you talked about the importance of the Black press during this time and elevating their voices. Do you think that there's something right now that the media could be doing to help underrepresented players, and something that the media needs to be doing to speak up more in this case?
The media can always speak up more. You know, I'll tell you, as a journalist, as someone who makes my living in the media, I always have to laugh when people talk about the media having an agenda, and people will say, well, the liberal media, this agenda, as if some morning, every single morning, every single media platform across America gets on a conference call and settles into the day's agenda. Sometimes I wish that was the case, but nothing could be further from the truth. I think that the media can always do better, like anything else, can always do more. I think the media is seeing now, with the case of Brian Flores, that they could have been doing a lot more. Listen, the Rooney Rule in the NFL, right, where you're supposed to, NFL teams are supposed to interview at least one qualified minority applicant for a head coach. That Rooney Rule is not new. So where's been the focus on the fact that it's been basically just a meaningless thing since its inception? Obviously, the media could do a much better job. I hope they will. I hope they will.
I hope so too.
We will, I should say.
Are there any other questions that people have? If there are, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A or into the chat.
But I wish that this was in person for a couple of reasons. Not only would I far prefer to be talking to people in person, but the Vilna Shul is such an amazing place. I think I mentioned to you, Olga, early on in our conversations about planning this, that I haven't been back to the Vilna since it reopened. And the last time I was in there about 3 or 4 years ago, it had just started to be renovated. So the building was literally a shell at that time. And that's when I first spoke about maybe coming back, because before Brooklyn I was just starting to work on it. So I was so disappointed when we weren't able to be there in person. But maybe the next book. Maybe the next book.
We were too. We would love to come. Have you come to the Vilna? You can come visit anytime, and we really hope to do events with you in person and welcome everyone back.
Love to, because it's such a special place. The last remaining immigrant era Jewish synagogue in the city. It really is. Boy, if those walls could talk.
Yeah. Well, on that note, we'll end the presentation and just also say I'll drop in the conversation upcoming events that we'll have at the Vilna, both virtual and in-person opportunities to connect. And again, you have here Ted's email here if you want a copy of his signed book. Please feel free to reach out. And again, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. And Ted, thank you again so much for such a fascinating presentation.
Thank you, Olga and Stephanie. Thank you both for your help. And folks, thank you all for coming out and joining us tonight. I really appreciate it. Stay safe. Think of Ukraine.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.